For years, New Zealand was held up as a model nation. Breathtaking landscapes, political stability, a quality of life envied around the world. Economists even called it a rock star economy, growing faster than many of its developed peers. But today, that same country is facing its worst economic downturn since 1991. Record numbers of people are leaving, productivity is falling, housing and basic living costs have spiralled out of reach for many. But how did this paradise fall from grace? Today, we're uncovering why New Zealand is going broke and what it will take to pull it back from the brink. New Zealand's economy is often sold to the world as a model of stability, clean, green and open for business. But peeling back that image, you'll find much of its wealth rests on a surprisingly narrow base. Around 60% of all goods exports come from just a handful of primary products, often with minimal processing before they're shipped abroad. The giant in the room is dairy. Every year, dairy exports bring in around 18 billion New Zealand dollars, roughly a quarter of all goods exports. It's a sector that's been an engine of rural prosperity for decades, but it's also one that's highly exposed to the fluctuations of a few key markets. Right now, 26% of all dairy exports go to China. That means more than a quarter of this economic pillar depends on the demand and political climate of a single trading partner. Dairy is followed by meat, beef and lamb, worth about $8.4 billion a year. That's around 12% of goods exports. Then there's forestry, roughly $5 billion annually. But here's the problem. Most of that is just raw logs. Logs are loaded into containers, sent overseas and processed into furniture, flooring and other products elsewhere. The higher value work and the jobs that come with it happen abroad. Seafood brings in around $2.5 billion, or about 3.5% of goods exports. Horticulture, including kiwi fruit, apples and wine, totals around $3.5 billion, roughly 5% of exports. These products have strong brand potential but still represent only a small slice of the pie. Now, here's the critical contrast. When you look at high-tech goods and advanced manufacturing, the kind of exports that drive innovation and lift productivity, New Zealand still lags far behind its peers. High-tech exports account for only around 13% of manufactured exports, which translates to a very small share of the country's overall goods exports, far lower than most OECD economies. In OECD rankings, New Zealand's share of high-value, high-tech exports is well below the group's average. Other developed economies have built far larger value-added sectors, which generate higher wages, greater resilience, and stronger tax bases. By comparison, New Zealand's export profile remains heavily concentrated in primary commodities. This narrow export base carries three big risks. Firstly, environmental limits. Land, water and soil can only handle so much extraction before productivity drops or regulations tighten. Dairy, for example, faces increased scrutiny over water use and pollution. Second, climate change. Shifting weather patterns can disrupt agriculture, forestry and fisheries. Droughts hit milk production. Warmer seas affect fish stocks. Storms damage orchards. We've already seen how 26% of dairy goes to China. A slowdown in Chinese demand, a trade dispute or geopolitical tension could hit New Zealand's export earnings hard. Put it together and you have an economy overexposed to commodity cycles and global shocks without the cushion of a strong, diversified industrial base. And because so much of the export portfolio is raw or lightly processed, the country misses out on the higher profits, higher wages and deeper innovation ecosystems that come from producing more sophisticated goods. It's like owning a gold mine, but selling the gold ore without refining it. Someone else gets the biggest payday. In a stable global market, this might not feel urgent, but in an era of climate volatility, shifting trade alliances and growing geopolitical risk, relying on a few unprocessed exports is like balancing an entire economy on a very small platform. For decades, New Zealand hasn't just had a housing market, it's had a housing fixation. Property has become the country's main investment vehicle, the default destination for capital flows, and it shows up clearly in the numbers. Real estate services account for around 11% of GDP, and when you add construction, that's another 5 to 6%. Together, this means that a huge slice of the economy revolves around buying, selling, and building houses, not necessarily building productive industries. This obsession has created a wealth illusion. On paper, many homeowners feel richer, but that wealth is tied to the value of their homes, not to productive assets that generate exports or innovation. And the price growth has been extreme. Over the past decade, house prices rose by around 130%. The problem is not just that prices rose, it's how far they've drifted from incomes. The median house now costs 8.8 times the median household income. For context, the OECD considers a multiple of around 3 times to be affordable. New Zealand's ratio is nearly triple that benchmark. When affordability gets this bad, it changes behaviour. Younger generations are locked out of home ownership or must take on massive debt. Older generations, sitting on property wealth, often see little reason to invest elsewhere. After all, why risk money in a business when the house value keeps climbing? But here's where the illusion turns dangerous: the mortgage reset cliff. About 40% of all home loans were taken out in 2020 to 21, when interest rates were under 3%. Many of these loans are now rolling over at 6% or higher. That means monthly repayments for some households could double almost overnight. For families already stretched, this isn't just a budgeting challenge, it's a potential crisis. Higher repayments mean less money spent elsewhere in the economy, slowing growth. Defaults could rise and forced sales could push prices down, hurting those who believe property values could only go up. The bigger issue? When so much national wealth is tied up in housing, capital is not flowing into the sectors that drive productivity, innovation and exports. Instead, it sits in bricks and mortar. Over time, that means the economy grows more slowly than it could, even as property prices create the illusion of prosperity. And while property may feel safe, a nation can't build a strong future on houses alone. If you want to understand why New Zealand's economy feels stuck, you can't just look at housing or exports. You have to look at how much the country invests in its own future, and the answer is not enough. New Zealand spends just 1.4% of its GDP on research and development. The OECD average is 2.7%, which is nearly double. That's not just an accounting difference. It means that while other developed nations are pouring resources into new technologies, medical breakthroughs, and advanced manufacturing, New Zealand is spending less than half the benchmark. Over time, that gap compounds into a serious disadvantage. When R&D spending is low, fewer high-value industries emerge. Startups have a harder time growing. Universities struggle to commercialize research, and companies fall behind global competitors. That's why underinvestment in innovation isn't just a missed opportunity, it's a slow drain on the country's economic potential, making it harder to generate the kind of high-paying jobs that keep people in the country. The result shows up clearly in productivity numbers. From 2012 to 2022, labour productivity in New Zealand grew by just 0.3% per year. Across the OECD, the average was 1.5%, which is 5 times higher. So why does this matter? Because productivity is the engine of economic growth. If workers can produce more value per hour, wages can rise without causing inflation. Businesses can expand and the government collects more tax revenue without raising rates. But when productivity barely moves, the economy can't grow sustainably and incomes stagnate while costs keep climbing. That's exactly what's happening in New Zealand today. There's another measure that captures the same weakness: the Economic Complexity Index. This global ranking measures how sophisticated and diverse a country's exports are. In 2023, New Zealand ranked 50th in the world. Being 50th means New Zealand exports simpler, less processed goods compared to peers. That leaves the economy more exposed to commodity price swings and global demand shocks. Countries higher up the ranking have more economic shock absorbers. When one industry slows, others can pick up the slack. New Zealand doesn't have that luxury, which can make downturns deeper and recovery slower. But perhaps the most worrying sign of all is the loss of talent, the very people who could help reverse this trend. In 2023 alone, around 40,000 skilled New Zealand citizens left the country, many for Australia and beyond. These aren't just any migrants, they're engineers, scientists, IT professionals, healthcare specialists, and entrepreneurs. When they leave, they take with them years of education, experience, and the potential to start the next big company or design the next breakthrough product. A country can't innovate when it's losing its innovators. When investment in R&D is low, productivity growth is weak, the economy lacks complexity, and skilled people leave for better opportunities, all of those forces feed into each other. The result is an economy that slowly falls behind, even if on the surface, the country still looks prosperous. New Zealand's challenge is that it's been able to mask these weaknesses with property booms and high commodity prices. But as those props start to wobble, The lack of innovation capacity becomes a core reason why the country risks going broke in a global economy that rewards speed, adaptability, and high-value industries. And as we'll see now, the innovation deficit doesn't exist in isolation. It's deeply connected to another trend reshaping the country, one that's already visible in departure lounges across the nation. New Zealand is experiencing what can only be described as a record-breaking exodus. In 2024 alone, 128,700 people left the country, the largest annual number ever recorded. This is a historic shift in the population's trajectory and one with deep economic consequences. Traditionally, when Kiwis left, it was mostly young people chasing overseas experiences, the classic overseas experience in Australia, the UK, or further afield. But that's changed. Now the departures include mid-career families with children, and even retirees, groups that historically stayed and reinvested their skills or savings into the local economy. Many of these people are unlikely to return, especially once their centre of gravity, their close family and community ties, shifts overseas. The reasons are painfully pragmatic. Across the Tasman and Australia, wages are on average 26% higher for similar work, and in certain industries, the pay gap stretches to 200%. That's not just a nice bonus, it's the difference between treading water and actually building wealth. And it's not just about pay. Job prospects are stronger, career progression is faster, and the day-to-day cost pressures, from groceries to mortgages, often feel lighter. The mass movement is leaving visible scars, particularly in small towns and provincial areas. Sociologists and demographers warn of a hollowing out effect. The departure of working-age adults, the people who staff schools, run small businesses, volunteer in community groups, undermines the social and economic fabric of these places. In places like Oakunu, for instance, job losses from mill closures were followed by a wave of residents heading overseas. The result? Shuttered storefronts, falling school enrolments, and public services under pressure. Once school roles drop far enough, teacher layoffs follow. Once the local GP retires, replacing them becomes almost impossible. The loss is also a demographic feedback loop. When mid-career families leave, they often take children with them, shrinking the pipeline of future workers. And when retirees relocate, often to join their adult children in Australia, they take their spending power, savings, and community involvement with them. The combined effect is a slow-motion drain of both human and financial capital. And while immigration still brings in new arrivals, the skills in industries they fill often don't match the ones being lost. Many new migrants are concentrated in lower-wage sectors like caregiving, hospitality, or seasonal agriculture, which don't replace the mid to high-skilled roles vacated by some departing Kiwis. If this trend continues, the risk is clear. Not just a smaller workforce, but a weaker economy. And while policymakers talk about strategies to bring people back, the reality is that once someone has settled, built a career, and put kids into schools overseas, the odds of return are slim, which raises the bigger question. If New Zealand can't retain talent, how do they rebuild the economic foundations they're losing? When the pandemic hit, the government moved fast, very fast. Borders slammed shut and massive fiscal stimulus was rolled out to keep businesses afloat and households solvent. On paper, it worked. The economy avoided immediate collapse, but beneath the surface, it set off a chain reaction. That stimulus, combined with supply chain bottlenecks, poured fuel on already hot housing markets and drove consumer demand beyond what the economy could supply. Inflation began climbing, and it didn't stop. The housing effect was even more dramatic. With interest rates at record lows and borders keeping people and their savings inside the country, property prices soared to historic levels. As we discussed earlier, this wasn't just about people buying homes to live in, it was a speculative fever. The very policies meant to protect the economy had supercharged one of its most unstable foundations. Then came the other side of the policy swing, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's record-fast interest rate hikes. The central bank didn't just nudge rates higher, it openly stated it was aiming to induce a recession to cool inflation. By May 2024, it had succeeded. The economy was officially contracting. Only later did it begin cutting rates again, but by then, much of the damage was done. And part of the problem was decision-making in the dark. Flawed and delayed economic data meant policymakers weren't always reacting to reality. In December 2024, Statistics New Zealand revised past GDP numbers, revealing that growth had been stronger than first thought in 2023, but also that the mid-2024 downturn was worse than initially reported. That kind of whiplash in the data erodes confidence and makes it harder to set the right course. If that wasn't enough, fiscal policy began pulling in the opposite direction. While the private sector was already slowing under higher interest rates, the government moved to cut spending hard. Public sector job cuts ran into the thousands, especially in Wellington, and regional investment projects were delayed or shelved. In normal times, these might be seen as belt-tightening measures, but during an active downturn, they pulled even more demand out of the economy. The outcome? By the end of 2024, HSBC ranked New Zealand as the worst performing developed economy in the world. Unemployment climbed to the highest levels in over 4 years, and business failures were happening at the fastest pace in more than a decade. For many, this meant layoffs, shuttered storefronts, and stalled projects in their own communities. But here's how this fits into the bigger picture of New Zealand going broke. First, the overheating of stimulus, and then the overcorrection of aggressive tightening destabilised both households and businesses, leaving them more indebted and less resilient. Second, mixed signals and data revisions undermined confidence from both investors and ordinary citizens in the country's economic management. And finally, these policy swings exposed structural weaknesses in the economy. They didn't create New Zealand's narrow export base or productivity gap, but they magnified the consequences. When you push a fragile system to its limits, it breaks faster. In addition to all of these economic shocks and structural weaknesses, there's an even deeper force at work. New Zealand's population is ageing rapidly. Right now, 18% of citizens are over the age of 65, and by 2034, that share is projected to reach 21%. That might sound like a small shift, but in fiscal terms, it's a game changer. Pension costs, already one of the largest line items in the national budget, will rise sharply as more people qualify for superannuation and live longer on it. The problem is the pool of future workers paying into that system is shrinking. Fertility rates have been sliding for years, meaning fewer young people will be entering the workforce just as more retirees are drawing from it. This creates a dependency ratio problem. Fewer taxpayers supporting more pensioners, which puts immense strain on both public finances and economic growth. And while the age profile is shifting, the health profile isn't helping. New Zealand has the third highest obesity rate in the OECD, which drives up long-term healthcare costs. Mental health issues are also on the rise, with more people needing access to services that are already stretched thin. These trends aren't just social concerns, they're fiscal time bombs, adding billions in projected healthcare spending over the coming decades. Then there's the physical foundation of the country, its infrastructure. Estimates put New Zealand's infrastructure deficit between $200 billion and $400 billion, and some experts argue it could be even higher. Roads, public transport, water systems, hospitals and schools all need massive investment to keep pace with future demand. Yet year after year, underinvestment continues. Every delay compounds the cost, pushing the bill onto the next generation. All this feeds into a growing social strain. 400,000 people now rely on welfare support, the highest number since the 1990s. Inequality is widening and home ownership is slipping out of reach for a larger share of the population. For many New Zealanders, the dream of stability is being replaced by a constant fight to make ends meet. These are deep structural changes that will define the country's future. An ageing population, fewer workers, rising healthcare costs, crumbling infrastructure and growing inequality. Each of these would be a serious problem on its own. Together, they form an economic and social storm that, if left unaddressed, could ravage New Zealand and turn it from a prosperous developed nation into one facing long-term economic stagnation. So, can New Zealand reinvent itself before the crisis hardens into permanence? Or will it shun the bold reforms needed and face decades of slow decline? The signs are already here. An ageing population, shrinking workforce, rising costs and infrastructure crumbling faster than it's rebuilt. These aren't distant threats, they're today's reality. But the future isn't yet sealed. A paradise can weather storms if it chooses to strengthen its foundations now. The real question is whether leaders and citizens alike are willing to act before the window for change closes. What kind of New Zealand will we choose to leave behind?